They told me he drowned 3 hours before my son took his first breath. I remember the exact way the nurse said it because she had to say it twice. The first time, I thought she was talking about somebody else's husband. I was 26, soaked in sweat, holding a baby who hadn't stopped screaming since they put him on my chest, and a woman in scrubs was standing at the foot of my bed telling me that the Coast Guard had called the front desk because they couldn't reach my cell. The fishing boat my husband worked on had gone over off the Oregon coast in a squall near Tillamook. 4 men, 2 pulled out of the water, 2 not. My husband was one of the 2 they couldn't find. I kept asking her if she was sure. She kept saying she was so sorry. And the whole time my son was wailing and I was looking at his red, furious little face thinking, your father will never see this. Your father is in the ocean right now, and I had no way to make those 2 facts fit inside the same minute. His name was Daniel. We'd been married 4 years. We met at a community college in Astoria, where I was finishing a nursing prerequisite and he was taking a welding course he never finished. He had this laugh that started low and then ran away from him. He smelled like diesel and coffee. He proposed to me on the jetty with a ring he'd put on layaway for 8 months, and when I said yes, he actually sat down on the rocks because his legs gave out. That was the man I married. That was the man they told me the sea had taken on the 8th of October while I was pushing our child into the world in a hospital, 40 miles inland. There was no body. That's the part nobody warns you about. There was no body, so there was no funeral, the way other people have funerals. There was a memorial at the little Lutheran church his mother went to with a framed photo on an easel and a folded flag they gave me even though he was never in the service, just because somebody decided I should have something to hold. People came up to me and said he was at peace now. I wanted to scream at every single one of them, at peace. He was 30 years old. He didn't want peace. He wanted to teach our kid to fish. I named our son after my father. I'll just say his name was Thomas because that part matters less than you'd think. The insurance was complicated because of the no-body thing. We had a small policy through the boat's owner, the kind those crews are supposed to carry, and it took 14 months and a death certificate issued in absentia before anything came through. $41,000. I remember the number because I remember sitting at the kitchen table of our rented duplex, doing the math on how long $41,000 lasts, when you are a single mother who hasn't finished her nursing degree, and your son needs daycare so you can finish it. The answer, if you're curious, is not very long. So I did what people do. I worked. I finished the degree at night, taking Thomas to a neighbor who watched 4 kids in her living room for cash. I became an LPN, then bridged to RN 3 years later because the pay difference meant we could move out of the duplex and into an actual house. A little 2-bedroom in a town I'll call Cedar Hollow, with a yard the size of a parking space and a maple tree that turned the most absurd orange every October. Every October. The same month, I used to stand under that tree on the anniversary and let myself cry for exactly as long as it took the coffee to go cold, and then I'd go back inside and be a mother. Thomas grew up not knowing his father except as a story and a shoebox. The shoebox had Daniel's watch in it, and the ring he put on layaway, and a photo of the 2 of us on the jetty, and a voicemail I'd transferred from phone to phone for 20 years, even when it cost me extra to keep the old number alive. 41 seconds of Daniel telling me he was running late. He loved me. He grabbed milk on the way home. I never played it for Thomas. I told myself it was because it would upset him. The truth is, I couldn't share it. It was the last living piece of the man, and I was selfish with it. My son was a good kid. Easy in the ways that count. He had Daniel's laugh, the one that ran away from him, and every time it happened my heart did this thing in my chest like a dropped glass that doesn't break. He played baseball badly and loyally. He got into a state school for engineering 2 hours away, and I drove him there in a U-Haul and cried the whole way back and didn't apologize to anybody for it. Here's the part where I tell you that for 20 years, I believed every word of that story. The squall. The 2 men they couldn't find. The peace he was supposedly at. I built my entire life on top of it like it was bedrock. I dated a little, never seriously, because how do you explain to a man that you're still half married to the ocean? I kept the maple tree. I kept the shoebox. I kept the voicemail. And then last spring, Thomas came home for a weekend, and he sat down at my kitchen table with a face I had never seen on him before, and he said, "Mom, I have to tell you something, and I need you to sit down first." I was already sitting down. I told him so. He didn't laugh. "I saw Dad," he said. I want to tell you I reacted with grace. I didn't. I told him that wasn't funny. I told him I didn't know what kind of joke this was, but he needed to stop it right now. My hands were already shaking and I didn't know why, because the thing he was saying was impossible, and impossible things don't make your hands shake. He pulled out his phone. He'd been at a regional engineering conference in Boise the month before, he said. The kind of thing with a hotel ballroom and lanyards and bad coffee. And on the second day, during a vendor expo, he'd walked past a booth for a water treatment equipment company, and there was a man working the booth, maybe late 50s, gray at the temples, and Thomas had stopped because the man laughed at something a coworker said. He laughed, and it started low and then ran away from him. I didn't know why I stopped, Thomas said. I just felt sick, like I knew him. And then I looked at his name tag. He turned the phone toward me. It was a photo Thomas had taken badly from the side of a man in a polo shirt with a company logo, and the name tag said a name that was not Daniel's. It said a first name I didn't recognize and a last name I didn't recognize. But the face, God help me, the face was older and heavier and the hairline had gone, but it was Daniel's face. It was the face I had married. It was the face I had grieved for 20 years under a maple tree. I didn't faint. I want that on the record, because it would be a cleaner story if I had. Instead, I got very, very calm in a way that frightened my son more than screaming would have. I asked him what the man had said. Thomas told me he'd introduced himself, shaken Dad's hand, made small talk about the equipment, and the whole time his father had looked at him with absolutely no recognition. None. His own son, 20 years old, standing 2 feet away, and the man hadn't blinked. He didn't know me, Thomas said. And that was when my son, my grown engineer son who hadn't cried in front of me since he was 12, put his face in his hands at my kitchen table. The man on the boat had a daughter, it turned out. I learned this over the next several weeks because once you know a person isn't dead, finding the rest is just a matter of refusing to stop. The company website had a staff page. The staff page had a bio. The bio mentioned that he and his wife of 15 years lived in a suburb of Boise with their daughter, a sophomore in high school. 15 years. Do the math with me. 20 years since the squall. 15 years married to a woman in Idaho, which left a 5-year gap I would think about for the rest of my life. 5 years where my husband was somewhere, alive, breathing, choosing every single day not to come home, before he even met the woman who didn't know she was the second one. I'm a nurse. I deal in evidence, so I want to walk you through what I confirmed before I let myself believe it. Because in those first weeks, I tried very hard to find the version where I was wrong. I called the boat owner's old company, which had been bought out twice but still had records. The original Coast Guard report listed 2 missing, presumed drowned. Presumed. That word had been sitting in a filing cabinet for 20 years, and nobody had ever made me look at it. Presumed drowned. They never found him because there was nothing to find, because he was never in the water. What I think happened, what I have pieced together and will never fully prove, is this. The boat went down for real. 4 men went into the water in a storm. 2 were pulled out, and in the chaos of that night, with the squall and the dark and the count gone wrong, my husband saw a door open that most people never get, and he walked through it. He had a buddy on the dock, a man I'd met twice, who I now believe drove him south that same night. He let the sea take the blame for a choice. He let a 30-year-old man die on paper, so that a 30-year-old man could go be somebody else. And the night he chose it, the night he decided that whatever was waiting for him in that hospital 40 miles inland was less than whatever he wanted instead, I was in a delivery room screaming his name and our son's name in the same breath. There was a question I couldn't stop asking myself, and I'll be honest, it was an ugly one. It wasn't why. I'd given up on why. The question was, did he ever drive through Cedar Hollow? Did he ever, in 20 years, get curious enough about the wife and the baby he'd left to die without him, to drive past the maple tree on a fall afternoon and see if we were still standing? I'll never know. But I'll tell you that the not knowing is its own kind of haunting, and it doesn't come off. Thomas wanted to go to Boise. I told him no. Then he told me he'd already emailed the man through the company contact form written as himself, said he believed they'd met at the conference, and that he thought they might be related. And the man had written back. He'd written back. That was the thing that finally cracked me. Not the photo, not the staff page, not the word presumed. It was that this man, this stranger wearing my husband's face, had received an email from a young man who was obviously, unmistakably his son, and instead of pretending he never got it, instead of blocking the address and running again, he had written back 2 sentences. He said he thought there'd been a misunderstanding, but he was willing to meet and talk. Willing. Like he was doing us a favor. Like 20 years was a scheduling conflict. I read those 2 sentences maybe 400 times. And somewhere in there, the grief I'd been carrying for 2 decades curdled into something else. Because you can grieve a dead man. There's a shape to it, a place to put it. You cannot grieve a man who is sitting in a suburb of Boise in a polo shirt, willing to talk. We met him. I need you to understand that I went, even after everything, partly because Thomas needed to look his father in the eye, and partly because I needed to, the way you need to touch a stove you already know is hot. We drove to Boise. We met at a chain restaurant near the highway, the kind with laminated menus and a salad bar nobody uses, because that's the kind of place you pick when nobody knows what the appropriate venue is for resurrecting the dead. He was already in the booth when we got there. He stood up. He was shorter than I remembered, or I was taller in my memory of being young. And when he saw me, his face did something I'll never forget, because for half a second, before he caught it, there was the boy from the jetty, the one whose legs gave out. He recognized me. Whatever he'd told himself, whatever name was on the tag, he knew exactly who I was. And then he sat back down and put on the face of a reasonable man who wanted to clear up a misunderstanding. He told us a story. He'd hit his head that night, he said. He didn't remember much. He'd been disoriented, he'd wandered, he'd ended up in another state with no memory of who he was, and by the time things came back to him, years had passed, and he had a new life, and he didn't know how to come back, and the longer he waited, the more impossible it got. He delivered it smoothly. He'd clearly told it before, maybe to the woman in Idaho, maybe just to himself in the mirror for 20 years until it wore a groove. I let him finish. Thomas was rigid beside me. And then I asked him one question. I asked him what the name was on the policy he must have known the boat carried, the death benefit that would have come to me. I asked if he knew it took 14 months. I asked if, in all that disorientation and all that lost memory, he'd ever once wondered about the wife who was sitting in a duplex doing math at a kitchen table with a baby on her hip. He didn't answer. He looked at the laminated menu. And that was my answer. I'm not going to pretend there was a satisfying explosion. There wasn't. The terrible thing about real life is that the villain doesn't confess and weep. He just goes quiet and stares at a menu, and you realize he is exactly as small as the choice he made. There was no head injury. We both knew it. A man with amnesia doesn't keep his own laugh. A man with amnesia doesn't, when his grown son emails him out of nowhere, write back 2 careful, lawyerly sentences. He builds those sentences out of fear, and you only fear what you remember. I asked him if he wanted anything from us. I made myself ask it kindly, because Thomas was watching, and I wanted my son to remember that his mother stayed a human being. And the man, my husband, the boy from the jetty, looked at Thomas and not at me. And he said he'd like the chance to know his son. Just his son. He said it like a reasonable request. He'd left me for dead in a delivery room. He'd let the ocean take the blame. He'd built a whole second family and a whole second daughter, and now that the math had caught up with him, he wanted to keep the one piece of the old life that didn't come with a bill attached. He wanted Thomas. He didn't say one word about wanting to make anything right with me. There was nothing to make right in his ledger. I was just the cost of the door he'd walked through. I want to tell you what my son did, because it's the only part of this whole thing I'm proud of, and I didn't even do it. Thomas stood up. He's a quiet kid, takes after me more than anyone realized. And he said, "You don't get to pick the easy part." That was it. 5 words. He said it without shaking. And then he looked at the man for a long moment, the way you look at a house you used to live in, and he said, "She was there for all of it. You weren't there for any of it. I know which one of you is my parent." And he walked out to the car. I stayed for 1 more minute. Not for him. For me. I reached into my bag and I took out the shoebox. Because I'd brought it, I don't fully know why. Maybe to give it back. Maybe to make him look at the proof of what he'd thrown into the ocean along with himself. I took out the watch and I set it on the table in front of him. I told him I'd kept it for 20 years, thinking it was all that was left of a good man. I told him I understood now that I'd been grieving someone who never died and never existed, both at once. I left the watch. I kept the voicemail. He doesn't get to be in the part of me that still sounds like the jetty. Then I walked out into a Boise parking lot under a sky that had no maple trees in it, and I got in the car next to my son, and neither of us said anything for about 30 miles, and then he reached over and held my hand the way he had when he was small, and I drove us home. People ask me if I'm angry. I'm not. Not the way I was that first spring. Anger is a thing you feel towards someone who took something from you. And the longer I sit with it, the more I understand that he didn't take 20 years from me. I had those 20 years. I had the maple tree and the night degree and the U-Haul and the bad baseball and the laugh that ran away from both of them. He's the one who missed it. He traded all of it for a door, and the cruelest joke, the one I'd never wish on anyone but can't help noticing, is that he doesn't even know what he traded it for. He has no idea who Thomas is. He'll never know. The man in Idaho has a daughter who doesn't know her father, once had another whole family he left for dead. I think about her sometimes. She's a kid. None of it is hers to carry. I hope nobody ever puts it on her. That's the thing about a lie this size. It doesn't stay where you bury it. It surfaces in other people's lives like debris off a wreck, washing up on shores that had nothing to do with the storm. We had the death certificate corrected. That was its own strange afternoon, sitting in a county office explaining to a very patient clerk that the deceased was, in fact, selling water treatment equipment in another state. There may be legal consequences for him. A lawyer told me the insurance fraud alone could be actionable, though after 20 years and across the question of intent, it gets complicated, and honestly, I decided I didn't have it in me to spend another decade of my life in a courtroom feeding him my attention. He'd already had 20 years of it for free. I wasn't going to volunteer more. The maple tree turned orange again this past October. I stood under it like I have every year. But I didn't cry for the man in the squall, because there was no man in the squall. I stood there and I let myself feel something I'd never let myself feel in 20 Octobers, which was relief, plain and uncomplicated. That I had never built my real life around the version of him that wrote back 2 sentences. I built it around a baby who screamed in a delivery room and grew into a man who stood up in a chain restaurant and said 5 words and walked out into the parking lot ahead of me. The coffee went cold the way it always does. I went back inside. Thomas had called the night before just to talk, no reason, the way he does now. I'd saved the voicemail he left, the new one, alongside the old one I've carried for 20 years. I keep them both. But I noticed lately that it's the new one I play. For 20 years, I thought the ocean had decided my life for me. It hadn't. A man had, on a dark night in a single quiet choice, and then he let the water carry the blame so he'd never have to say the words out loud. That's the thing I understand now that I didn't at 26. Almost nothing that happens to us is really an accident. Daniel didn't disappear because of a storm. He disappeared because of who he already was, and the storm just gave him cover. Every life is built one decision at a time, and the bill always comes due, even if it takes 20 years to arrive at a chain restaurant near a highway. What I'd tell anyone watching, especially anyone who's been left holding a baby and a debt and a story that doesn't add up, is that you get to decide who you become in the aftermath. Daniel made his choice. I made mine. He chose the easy door, and the cruelest part of his punishment is one he'll never even feel. He doesn't know his own son. He traded the laugh, the bad baseball games, the U-Haul, all of it, for a polo shirt and a lie he has to keep telling. That's not freedom. That's a smaller cage with better furniture. I want you to hold on to 3 things, because they're what carried me. The first is your own decency, the refusal to let what was done to you turn you into the kind of person who does it to someone else. I went to Boise angry, and I left having stayed a human being in front of my son. That mattered more than any revenge would have. The second is your clear eyes. I'm a nurse, so I checked the records. I read the word presumed. I refused to believe the comfortable story just because it hurt less. Seeing the truth plainly, even when it's ugly, is how you stop being someone's victim and start being your own witness. And the third is the plain, unglamorous strength of just getting up. The night degree. The neighbor who watched 4 kids for cash. The maple tree, every October. Nobody claps for that. There's no medal for the 10,000 ordinary mornings you choose your kid over your grief, but that's where real life actually gets built, one cold cup of coffee at a time. Thomas stood up in that booth and said 5 words, "I'll carry forever," and he didn't learn them from his father. He learned them from 20 years of watching someone stay. If you take anything from what I've told you, let it be this. The people who leave don't get to define you, and the people who stay don't need to be thanked, only matched. Be the one who stays. That's the whole thing. That's the entire lesson it took me half my life to learn.